The rain poured hard that evening, blurring the school windows into streaks of silver and gray. Most teachers had already left, their laughter echoing faintly down the hallways, but one man remained behind, wiping the chalk dust from the old blackboard with the same care he gave his lessons. His name was Daniel Hayes, a 27-year-old teacher whose passion for teaching burned brighter than the paycheck that barely paid his rent. He stayed late every day, grading papers, cleaning up the classroom, and fixing broken desks that the school couldn't afford to replace. To most, he was just a poor teacher with big dreams, but to his students, he was the kind of man who made them believe they could be more. That night, just as Daniel was locking the door, he heard something, the soft sound of crying. It was faint at first, but enough to make him stop. He followed the sound down the hallway until he reached the back of the building near the music room. There, sitting alone on a small wooden bench, was a little girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, her face hidden in her hands as she wept quietly. Her backpack lay on the floor, soaked from the rain that had seeped through the open window. If you believe in kindness, compassion, and second chances, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Silent Hope. Because sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change more than one life. Daniel knelt down beside her, speaking softly. She looked up, startled, her eyes red from crying, her uniform damp. There was something fragile about her, as if the world had been unkind for far too long. When he gently asked what was wrong, she told him her name was Lila, and that her mother had passed away 6 months ago. Since then, everything had felt different. Her father, a man always too busy with work, had grown colder, distant, buried in meetings and business trips. That day, a classmate had teased her about being the girl whose dad didn't care, and the words had cut too deep. So she stayed after school, too afraid to go home to silence again. Daniel listened without interrupting. He didn't have much, but he had patience, the kind that comes from understanding pain himself. He told her gently that her father probably loved her more than she could imagine, even if he didn't know how to show it. Then he offered her his umbrella and walked her to the school gate, making sure she got safely into the car that came to pick her up, a sleek black car driven by a uniformed chauffeur. Daniel noticed the luxury but didn't think much of it. His only concern was that she stopped crying. The next morning, Daniel arrived at school early, as always, ready to teach his literature class. He was surprised when the principal called him to the office. Sitting there was a tall, well-dressed man in an expensive navy suit, Alexander Reed, a name Daniel instantly recognized. The billionaire CEO of Reed Global Industries. One of the richest men in the city. The man's presence filled the room like quiet thunder. His sharp gray eyes, perfectly combed silver-streaked hair, and the faint sadness etched on his face made him look powerful yet broken. The principal introduced him formally and said Mr. Reed wanted to speak to Daniel privately. When they were alone, Alexander thanked him for helping his daughter the previous night. His voice was calm, but there was a heaviness behind it, the kind that only grief can cause. Daniel didn't know what to say. He simply replied that Lila was a wonderful student who just needed someone to listen. But something about the billionaire's expression caught his attention, a flicker of guilt, maybe even regret. Alexander handed him a card and said if he ever needed anything, to reach out. Then, before leaving, he said something unexpected, "You reminded my daughter that kindness still exists. Thank you." Days passed. Lila began smiling again in class. She worked harder, stayed focused, and every now and then, Daniel would find a small thank you note on his desk written in her neat handwriting. Her father, however, was still a ghost in her world. Always traveling, always busy. One afternoon, Daniel noticed Lila sitting alone again after school, staring at a drawing she made. It was of her father, and a woman with long hair standing together under a tree. She whispered that she missed her mom and that her dad never talked about her anymore. Daniel felt something ache inside him. He understood what loneliness felt like. He himself had lost his parents young, and every Christmas since, he had spent alone with only the echo of their voices in memory. He couldn't fix her world, but he could show her she wasn't alone. He began tutoring her after school, helping with homework, talking about life, and even letting her paint in the art room while he graded papers. Slowly, her laughter returned. What Daniel didn't know was that someone was watching. Alexander had quietly started coming by the school, parking across the street to see for himself what kind of man was spending so much time with his daughter. He saw Lila laughing for the first time in months, laughing with this young teacher who clearly had nothing but sincerity. It stirred something deep in him, a memory of his late wife, Evelyn, who had always believed in helping people no matter how small the act. Before she died of cancer, she had told him, "Don't let our daughter grow up thinking love is a weakness." But after she was gone, Alexander buried himself in work to escape the pain, until that kindness from a poor teacher began to remind him of everything he had lost. One Friday, Alexander approached Daniel after school. He thanked him again, this time more personally, and asked him to have dinner with them the following weekend. Daniel hesitated, unsure if he'd fit into a world of luxury and wealth, but eventually agreed for Lila's sake. When he arrived at the mansion that weekend, he was struck by how lifeless it felt, large, beautiful, but cold. Lila ran to greet him, proudly showing him her drawings displayed in the hallway. Alexander watched them, realizing how much warmth this humble man had brought into their home. Dinner was quiet at first, but soon filled with laughter. For the first time in years, Alexander felt like his house was alive again. After dinner, they sat by the fireplace. Alexander opened up, speaking of Evelyn, how losing her had broken him, how he had tried to fill the void with work, and how guilt had eaten away at him. Daniel listened quietly, his eyes reflecting empathy rather than judgment. He said softly that maybe the best way to honor Evelyn wasn't through success, but through the love she left behind in their daughter. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He walked through the halls, thinking about how a man with so little had managed to give his family what money never could: time, compassion, and presence. The next morning, he made a decision. A few weeks later, the school received a major anonymous donation, enough to rebuild classrooms, buy new supplies, and increase teacher salaries. Daniel had no idea it came from Alexander. He simply continued teaching, pouring his heart into every lesson. Lila's grades improved, her laughter grew louder, and her father started showing up at school events, sitting proudly in the back row. Months passed, and a strange friendship blossomed between the billionaire and the poor teacher. They came from opposite worlds, but both had lost something precious and were trying to rebuild. Alexander began volunteering his time at the school's charity events, using his resources to support programs Daniel had started for underprivileged kids. Together, they built a small reading center dedicated to Evelyn's memory, calling it the Hope Room. On the day of its opening, Lila stood on stage holding her father's hand and smiled at Daniel sitting in the front row. "My teacher once told me that kindness is something you give even when you have nothing," she said proudly. "And my mom used to say that love makes broken things whole again." I think both were right. The audience applauded, some wiping away tears. After the ceremony, Alexander pulled Daniel aside. He admitted that he was the donor and that he wanted to offer Daniel a new role, to lead a foundation they were starting together, one that would help schools and children in need across the city. Daniel was stunned. He had never sought wealth or recognition, only purpose. But now, he realized that perhaps fate had rewarded him not with riches, but with something far greater, the chance to change lives on a bigger scale. That Christmas, Daniel didn't spend the evening alone. He sat at a large dinner table surrounded by Lila, Alexander, and a few teachers from the school he loved. Laughter filled the air, candles flickered, and for the first time, he felt the peace that comes from being exactly where you're meant to be.